You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around? Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Welcome to all our listeners across Australia in every major city in this country. Now, if you wonder what anarchy is all about, anarchos without rulers, a society without rulers, not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve power, share power, possibly through direct democratic means, or the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Very, very simple concepts. Nothing radical about it. What's radical is the reaction of those people who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and their supporters in the state system. That's what's radical. What they're willing to do and what they have done over centuries to stop people enjoying, that's right, enjoying the spoils. Now tonight, if you are in Melbourne, I'll be doing a lecture on the Tolpuddle Martyrs, but a little statement I just like, hopefully I can remember it, which was made by George Lovelace when he returned from his incarceration in Van Diemen's Land for having the audacity to form England's first agricultural union, Friendly Society of Labourers, you know. And he said, and these were his words when he got back to England after he'd been pardoned. These were his exact words. Arise, men of Britain, and rally around the standards of liberty, or forever lay prostrate under the iron hand of your land and money-mongering taskmasters. Transportation did not have the desired effect on me, but after all, I've returned from my bondage with my views and principles strengthened. It is firmly fixed in my mind that labour is ill-rewarded in consequence of a few tyrannising over millions. I believe that nothing will ever be done to relieve the suffering of the working classes until they take it into their own hands. George Lovelace, 1837. Think about that. Almost, over 180 years ago? Similar problems today. Inequalities in power and wealth. Similar issues. Little seems to have changed. Now, also, I'd like to thank all those people who listened to the radiophone edition of the Anarchist World This Week, last week on Community Radio 3CR. That's the community radio station which Anarchist World This Week is a broadcast from, via the Community Radio Network across Australia, and we raised $8,500. Unfortunately, we are $3,000 short of our target. 3CR Community Radio is not dependent on advertising, not dependent on government funding, not dependent on the corporate media or anybody else. That's why you can hear programs like The Anarchist World This Week. And as I keep telling people, do what the rich and infamous do. If you're a wage earner and you pay taxes, redirect your taxes by giving a donation to Community Radio 3CR here in Melbourne. You can ring on 039 419 8377 and just say that you're ringing on behalf of the Anarchist World this week and you'd like to pledge so much. And if you do it before the 30th of June, which is not very far away, I think it's 10 days away, you'll be able to claim a legal, legitimate tax deduction. Or you can get a warm inner glow. Or you can go to 3cr.org.au/donate. And obviously, if you are listening to this program on another community radio station, support them as much as you can. As a volunteer, financially, whatever, because community radio is still relevant, still plays an important role in disseminating ideas in our society. Now, it's been a fascinating week. I'm interested in the concept of digital fascism. It's a fascinating little concept because very few people are talking about the dehumanising effect the digital revolution has on the individual, not just on communities, but on the individual. And in many regards, it reminds me of sheep being herded by sheepdogs to somewhere they don't want to go. And it seems everywhere we look, this digital revolution isn't about improving our lives, but it's about training us to act in ways which are contrary to our interests, but which increase the profitability of the corporate world. I mean, that's what the digital revolution has become about. We've even got the ridiculous situation where there are algorithms which push people into viewing material which promotes extraordinarily exploitive type of developments within the population, and we see this around the world. It's all about making a profit for those individuals and corporations which own these digital platforms and manipulate human emotion and dehumanise us in order to maximise their profits. And the fact is, every time you use an app, every time you use a self-service, in a supermarket, every time you're forced, to join the so-called digital revolution, it's another little strip of humanity which is stripped off your flesh. Not for the good of society, not for the good of the individual, but for the profits of a minority. As George Lovelace said, you can lay prostrate, that's right, lay prostrate under the iron hand of your land and money-mongering taskmasters. So think about it. Think about every time you get involved with this so-called digital revolution. Think about whether it actually assists you, not just in terms of convenience, but in terms of removing your autonomy, in terms of dehumanising you, in terms of pushing you into situations where you would not like to be. So digital fascism is a real issue, and it will continue to be a real issue while virtual platforms are owned by individuals or corporations or shareholders whose major responsibility is to increase profitability at the expense of the community, at the expense of our own human conditioning. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. And if you want to get, further information, a number of websites, YouTube channels, I suggest Public Interest Before Corporate Interest or josephtoscano.no, Facebook pages, web pages, anarchistmedia.org, Public Interest Before Corporate Interests, public housing, everybody's business, just goes on and on and on and on. But the reality is you can be the best, the greatest, the most, inane digital warrior in the universe, but unless you put your feet on the ground and work with other people and take action to change things, very little changes. Now, it's interesting that, and again, this is something that maybe didn't catch your attention, but Tommy Smith, the 1968 Olympic gold medalist, and John Carlos and Peter Norman in October 1968 were involved in a exceptionally important protest. And 5 decades on, Tommy Smith was invited to Paris before the Paris Olympics to give an oration. And in that oration, he highlighted the importance of Peter Norman, the silver medalist, the Australian silver medalist from Melbourne. He highlighted the fact that his solidarity was such an important part of their protest. And wasn't it and as he said, it was about human rights for everyone, regardless of colour, cause or nationality. Human rights for everyone. And Tommy Smith, at the age of 80, crying, said, "One of the greatest persons I've ever met," Smith said of Norma, was Peter Norman, one of the greatest persons he's ever met. So, after 50 years later, that action, which was, which had profound implications for the 3 athletes, continues to reverberate. I think what that shows us is that sometimes you need to do things that other people think are not quite right. And decades later, people begin to understand the significance of that action you took, irrespective of the personal cost. And Peter Norman's cost was enormous. Tommy Smith and Carlos's cost was enormous. They had their medals stripped off them. That's Carlos and Smith. But the thing is, it's about universal human rights, and we've seemed to have forgotten that concept of universality. That human beings, irrespective of our colour, our race, our nationality, the language we speak, our religious beliefs, our gender, our sexual orientation, we all should have those rights. And that's what anarchism is about. It's about breaking down that hierarchy, that boundaries, which allows a minuscule minority, as George Lovelace said in 1837, tyrannise millions. Let's move on. Have you noticed something interesting? I've noticed that the stock market, not that I've got any shares, but I've noticed that the stock market seems to be forever climbing, and that shareholder profits continue to increase. And I know you're all excited because you've all got superannuation. The younger people out there, you've got superannuation, and you think you're going to, have a great retirement. Actually, I mean, it's all about superannuation. It's all about you paying for your own old age. Could you imagine that? Paying for your own old age. But that's what it's about. It's about the privatisation of old age. It's about putting your future in your hands and the state washing its responsibility to the individual. to provide the basic necessities, whether the people are young or old. It's about washing their hands of that responsibility. But the fact is that over the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of people are beginning to understand what this is all about. Because it's been the people who generate those profits, the workers in industry, and the customers, who pay for the goods and services, who are bearing the cost of the current so-called financial downturn as interest rates soar. And the fact is that shareholder profits have continued to escalate. And the wealth of the richest 1% has doubled over the last decade. While we have constant stories about homelessness, about people not having food security, about the social dislocations which occur when people don't have enough to cover their expenses, of the growing group of workers, the working poor who at the end of the week don't actually have enough money because of, mortgages and rents and other costs, fees and charges, both at the state level and in the private sector. You've got to this situation where when are people going to say enough is enough? Do we really need to continue on this bandwagon that the private investment for private profit way is the only way? There is no other way that human beings can actually organise themselves to ensure that in a country as rich as Australia, the land of milk and honey, that the honey isn't rancid and the milk hasn't curdled, because a greedy few are taking everything, while the rest of us beg and beseech for the crumbs which are swept off the corporate table. Think about it. Why do we find ourselves in this situation? I mean, we now have an opposition which is talking about bankrolling a nuclear industry. We have a government which is throwing money left, right and centre to the corporate sector. It's just an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in 2024. And as George Lovelace said in 1837, it is indelibly fixed in my mind that labour is ill-rewarded in consequence of a few tyrannising over millions. And once again, irrespective of all the social gains which were made through struggle in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, we're seeing all that lost. And what do we do about it? Well, we say, let's borrow some more money. Let's do a bit more afterpay. Let's do that. Let's do this. Let's not rock the boat. The trouble is, you can rock the boat and actually get what you want, or you can starve to death. And I'm talking about metaphorically starving to death in terms of culture, in terms of ideas. And that's what we have. One idea, private investment for private profit, our mantra, our God, our Jehovah, whatever. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. Now, there are some fascinating terms, rules-based order, all right? We hear the Foreign Minister talk about the rules-based order. We hear about the Prime Minister talk about the rules-based order. We hear about the opposition leader talk about the rules-based order. We hear about the President of the United States talking about the rules-based order, right? So what's this rules-based order? What's it all about? Well, it's about ensuring that those who exercise power continue to exercise power, and those who accumulate wealth continue to accumulate wealth. And the hypocrisy regarding this so-called rules-based order is highlighted in the way what is happening in the Ukraine, we're told, is against the rules-based order, the international rules-based order, on a daily basis. And obviously what's happening in Ukraine is atrocious. But as far as Ukraine is concerned, the rules-based order is the name of the game. But in Gaza, nobody talks about the rule-based order. Nobody talks about the fact that the same rule, if we have a rule-based order, it should apply equally around the world. And the atrocities which are being committed in Gaza somehow are not passed, don't pass muster as far as a rules-based order is concerned. Well, what's happening in the Ukraine is against the rule-based order, but not what happens in Gaza. Just an extraordinary situation. The hypocrisy is just extraordinary because the atrocities continue. The carnage continues. But interestingly, there is a whiff of mutiny in the Israeli Defence Forces. Faced with the ongoing conflict in Gaza, which will have no political solution unless there is a permanent ceasefire, and faced with an escalating military situation on its northern border with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and faced with the increasing number of Israeli military that are dying in this conflict, and faced with no exit plan whatsoever, and faced with the Israeli Defence Forces becoming little more than an atrocity-making machine, senior members of the Israeli Defence Forces are now beginning to arc up against the current government. Now that the war cabinet has been dissolved. And we saw this 24 hours ago. I mean, although the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, didn't want a ceasefire on one road to allow aid to reach starving, that's right, starving men, women and children in northern Gaza, the Israeli military forces, their leadership, ignored the Prime Minister. So there is a whiff of mutiny. Not only are there protests in Israel itself, an increasing number of protests, but when a government no longer has complete control over its military arm, and the military arm is not willing to obey the commands of the government of the day, well, that government is about to dissolve. Because there is that whiff of mutiny we've never seen before in the Israeli Defence Force. It was obviously ordinary soldiers, not all of them, but many of the ordinary soldiers, because many of them are conscripts, are beginning to understand the significance of what they are being asked to do by a government which has completely forgotten that a human being is a human being. How many more women do we need to see carrying dead babies, screaming, "What has this baby done to you?" how many more atrocities do we need to see before the soldiers involved begin to say enough is enough? So there is that whiff of mutiny. Because remember, Israel ultimately depends on United States support. And if push comes to shove in northern Israel, and there's an all-out conflict there with Hezbollah, would Biden actually send troops into Israel? I doubt it. With an election in 4 to 5 months' time. So let's see what happens. So it's good to see that there are, despite the carnage, despite the increase in deaths, despite the atrocities which are occurring, despite mass starvation, despite all that, we now have come to a stage where the people who are ordered to carry out those activities are beginning to have second thoughts. And that's always an important moment in any war, when the people who are asked to carry out and make the supreme sacrifice to carry out government decisions, whether it's a dictatorship or a parliamentary democracy, balk at what they've been asked to do. Let's move on. Now, it's interesting, a lot of people say, what's the difference between an anarchist and a libertarian? Well, it's very simple. I mean, the anarchist struggle is the struggle for freedom from the state, that's for individual freedom, and freedom from market forces, freedom from the market. I mean, the market is nothing more than the private investment for private profit crew on steroids. That's what the market is. I mean, workers ask for a better share of the wealth that they produce. They're asking for freedom from the market. And the history of the last 150, 200 years has been that history of people demanding the state, which ultimately is a form of control, protects them from markets, from the market, this overwhelming beast, the market. So anarchists are against, we want freedom from the state and we want freedom from the market. Libertarians, they just want freedom from the state. They love the market. They love exploiting people. They love making a buck. It's a very simple difference. The state and the market, or the state and the market. Liberals, they want more freedom. And I'm talking about liberals, not our Liberal Party, obviously. They're conservatives. A little bit more freedom from the state. So the only people who actually agitate and fight for and organise for freedom from the state and the market are basically anarchists, because of our central tenet, that it's about inequalities in power and wealth. All right, so just a simple, little thing. Now, are you getting a little bit distressed? Yes, distressed. I know it's a horrible word. I'm a little bit distressed by the Australian media. And nothing highlights this more than the kerfuffle which occurred when a reporter for the Sky News, that great libertarian Sky News, freedom from the market, freedom for the market. Sky News, one of their reporters who'd been a political prisoner in China, the Chinese, was it kind of embassy overstepped the mark, became huge issue. Huge issue. Sky News, what a brilliant piece of theatre. What a brilliant piece of theatre by Sky News. I mean, the Murdoch media will do anything for a buck. Has to do all those virtual platforms, promoting misogyny. Anything for a buck. Anything for a buck. And I've found the current blacklisting of anybody from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation who has a pro-Palestinian viewpoint very, very confronting. Because you may not have noticed, but you'll find that anybody of any support for the Palestinian cause has now been basically blacklisted from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, not in terms of getting a little grab here and a grab there, but in terms of the terminology that is used, in terms of the people that are interviewed, in terms of their so-called balancing act, in terms of the way things are reported. Now, I'd expect that from the commercial media. I expect that from the commercial media. But do we really expect the same from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation? It's as if what's happening in Gaza doesn't matter. It's as if certain atrocities are acceptable and other atrocities aren't acceptable. And this is why I keep saying to people, that's why community radio is so important, especially programs like The Anarchist World This Week, which comes to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne, which are broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. That's why it's so important, because we're not going to be silenced because there's some type of editorial policies that says that, you can't speak about that or you can't speak about this, or some type of editorial policy, because there's volunteers, and I'm a volunteer. I don't give a shit, because I don't rely on a wage to do The Anarchist World This Week. I don't rely on being paid. I'm a volunteer. I've been doing this for almost 48 years now, 47 years. I just lied then. Fact checking. But, but when you have the same analysis coming from all segments of the media to support current tactics in terms of China, in terms of Ukraine, in terms of Gaza, and the list goes on, you begin to wonder where that word independent media comes from. Because obviously in the corporate-owned media, it's about making a buck. Now, as I keep telling you, Murdoch's, flagmast in Masthead, the Australian, has never made a profit. Now, Murdoch understands that, and his descendants, the fruits of his loins understand that. It's not about making a profit, it's about influencing people. And it's the same with all the major newspapers in this country. And you wonder why in Queensland there is such a conservative and in many regards reactionary views are so dominant. The fact is Queensland has been a one newspaper state for over 6 decades. The Murdoch media is the major, newspaper. And if you think newspapers are irrelevant, legacy media are irrelevant, and it's all, on the World Wide Web, think again. Because what the legacy media has, the power it has, it's the power to set the political, cultural, social agenda for the day. And that's why if you're a channel flicker or an internet surfer, you will notice the same issues are discussed in the same way. And that's a dilemma. There are no views that are different. Currently, China is the bogeyman. It reminds me of the 60s. The yellow peril? Remember the big picture they used to draw of China and the arrow down to Vietnam? And we had to fight the yellow peril in Vietnam. And over 500 Australians were killed in Vietnam. And the legacy of those that returned, the painful legacy as far as their families and friends are concerned, continues. And who is one of our main allies now? The Vietnamese Communist Party. Extraordinary, isn't it? And when it comes to words like freedom, independence, democracy, these are words that have lost any meaning. Democracy. Is parliamentary democracy democracy? Is electing somebody for 3 to 4 years and giving them a signed blank cheque, those of you who remember what a cheque is, to do what they like for the next 3 to 4 years, is that democracy? Rule of the people, by the people, for the people? Freedom? Freedom to do what? Freedom to buy shit? I mean, is that freedom? Freedom to become a consumer? To consume products which are not necessary, not based on the satisfaction of human needs, but manufactured products which are manufactured in order to ultimately increase profits, as George Lovelace said. It is indelibly fixed in my mind that labour is all rewarded in consequence of a few tyrannising over millions. What has changed? Independence? Are we an independent sovereign nation state when every move we make is tied to United States foreign policy and their particular agenda to continue to dominate the world? And when we talk about the Chinese government of the day, irrespective of all its shortcomings, the fact is that we are in this part of the world. And accommodation sometimes is necessary in order for survival. So when you hear words like freedom, independence, democracy, think again. I mean, one of the most obscene example in my mind is the sacrifice that was made in World War I by Australian soldiers, men and women. Women in the nursing corps and men who did the fighting. 62,000 dead, another 60,000 died within a decade of returning. And when we see, Anzac Day, they were fighting for democracy, they were fighting for freedom. They weren't fighting for democracy or freedom, they were fighting for God, King and country. They were fighting for the British Empire. How we change things. For example, the colonisation process, the almost total amnesia till 1992 that, First Nations people had rights to land in this country because of their prior occupation. And the list goes on and on. I noticed that our little friends from the IPA, I call them the Institute of Private Affairs, I can't use the word public with that mob, the Institute of Private Affairs is complaining because the word Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is used too much in primary schools, and they're concerned about this and they're concerned about that. Words are nuclear bombs. And we've seen how words have been used in this country, continue to be used to marginalise, ostracise people because of their views. I mean, anybody who's against the private investment of private profit mantra, which is in our DNA as a nation, is somehow an enemy of the state. Anybody who wants to remove legislation which rewards people for investing is somehow some type of satanic figure, some wild-eyed radical who has nothing to contribute to society. No wonder we continue day after day to go through the same rigmarole and see no change at the end of the day. Now, obviously there's been change in terms of the way of perception and some cosmetic changes because of identity politics, but ultimately, as far as power and wealth is concerned, no change. Well, there has been change, but it's been the opposite way. So all those revolutions and reformists that occurred since the French Revolution, and the American Revolution, pushed aside. Everything that was won, lost through privatisation. And the housing crisis is a classical example of the hypocrisy of the day. They talk about social housing, affordable housing, community housing, private housing, but when it comes to public housing, nothing. Nothing. The word somehow has become, evil. The word public, the many, the many, has become synonymous with second rate. And it's become synonymous with second rate because we have allowed, you and me, we have allowed the private sector to dominate the political discussion. So we've come to a situation where a party that calls itself the Labor Party has nothing to do with working people. We've come to the situation where we see political parties forming on the basis of promoting fear in the community, fear based on difference, as if there are different classes of Australians, not based on their economic income, but based on their opinions, the way they look. And that's why I said before at the beginning what Tommy Smith was talking about, the Olympic gold medalist, when he was in Paris 2 weeks ago, I think about a week ago, to present this special oration at the Paris Olympics. It's about universal human rights, something we seem to have forgotten. Universality. Not just the right to personal identity, but the right to access the Commonwealth. We do live in the Commonwealth of Australia, do we not? Think about it. As I said at the beginning of the program, this program comes to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne, and my name's Joseph Toscano. We've been broadcasting for a number of decades. Now, whether we've made an impact or not is irrelevant. What's relevant is that you do have the opportunity to listen to these views, and you have the opportunity to listen to these views not because I'm broadcasting on the government-gilded ABC or I'm broadcasting in the corporate-owned media, but because I'm broadcasting on community radio. And community radio was created by the Whitlam-led Labor government at the end of 74-75, that's almost, 60 years ago. It was created in order to give ordinary people with different ideas the ability to broadcast, not narrowcast, but broadcast their ideas to the population at large. And that's what we do through the National Community Radio Network, which I'm forever grateful for broadcasting the Anarchist World this week around this country. Because it's not just about ideas. It's about taking that next step. We can have all the ideas we like, we can have all the warm, fuzzy feelings we like, but ultimately, unless we become involved in activities, in different groups, to promote the concept of a universal, that's right, universal human rights. Not human rights which are restricted to certain groups of people, but universal human rights and universal access to society's wealth. then we will continue to have ad nauseum stories in this country of all countries, all sovereign nation states in the world, of poverty, of homelessness, of issues regarding the working poor, of the majority of the population contributing to corporate welfare, of us seeing the natural resources in this country exploited for the benefit of a minuscule minority who've become billionaires, of having every aspect of our living from birth, from cradle to death, dominated by a private investment for private profit mantra. And that's what we see from birth to death. If you find yourself born to parents who don't have the necessary economic resources to look after you, your ability in this country to get anywhere are minimal. And we've now got to the ridiculous situation where the state has moved out of the way of the corporate sector and allows them to exploit us for their shareholders. Such a ridiculous situation we find ourselves in 2024. If you told me in 1977, when I began this program, that we would be still fighting to ensure that children had enough to eat in this country, that there was enough resources for public education, enough resources for public health, enough resources for other things which are necessary, essential services in this country, that we will be still struggling while a minuscule minority continues to amass fortunes, I would tell you, you're an idiot. Well, I'm the idiot because almost 50 years later, we are fighting the same battles, and most of the political organisation, social organisation, cultural organisations which exist in this country today are about pushing the private investment for private profit mantra. It's become an essential component of our DNA. Now, a little bit of good news. Now, my late wife, Ellen Jose, died in 2017. But in 1992, she had a successful exhibition called Black Diggers, Ghost Fighters, where she raised a number of issues in that particular exhibition. And one of those important issues was the long-term effects that war has, not just on the people involved in the carnage, as we see in Gaza and the Ukraine, but the intergenerational effects, as we see, as a result of the frontier wars in this country and other wars. Because everybody loses. And that exhibition in 1992 opened a lot of people's eyes. And in many regards, it was an anti-war exhibition. Now, interestingly, the Australian War Memorial bought 6 of those paintings, and the Australian Museum in Canberra bought 3. And Jara Briggs, who was the curator of the Melbourne Art Trams, part of the Rising Festival, organised for one of Ellen's paintings, anti-war paintings, Longing and Touch, Distance and Time, which actually highlights the significant impact that war has on the children, as well as the wives, has on them. Intergenerational impact, generation after generation. Now, that particular work has now been placed on one of Melbourne's art trams. There were 6 art trams this year. And if you're interested, if you catch trams, tram route 48, which goes to, I think, Baldwin, and tram route 109, which goes to Docklands and goes down Collins Street. Ellen's artwork will be on display on that tram for the next 12 months. So if you get a chance, have a look at it, or go to the Rising webpage and have a look at it. And I think the important thing is, in this period where war, the drums of war are beating, not just in Gaza, not just in the Ukraine, not just in Burma, the drums of war are beating in our brain day after day as we've been conditioned to get ready for, another war. World War III. For what? For what? For what? To maintain a private investment for private profit society? To ensure that those who enjoy the wealth and riches continue to accumulate more wealth and riches? That those who cannot share or are, exploited continue to be exploited? It's just extraordinary. Extraordinary how the drums of war are beating, and how we as a people are lining up, pushing our children and grandchildren in front of us to be sacrificed on the killing fields for mammon. That's right. Pushing, being slowly manipulated. Nuclear submarines, US troops on Australian soil, more and more of them. All these alliances getting ready for the next big flare-up. For what? Not for freedom. Freedom from the market? No. Freedom from the state? No. Not for democracy, rule the people, by the people, for the people. Not for independence, but to ensure that the same system continues ad nauseum, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And somehow we need to pay a blood sacrifice. But today that blood sacrifice is extraordinary. Because if there is miscalculation and there is war, as we see in Gaza and the Ukraine, the major victims will be the civilian population. 90 to 95% of casualties in 21st century warfare is the civilian population. Look at Iraq, over 1 million dead. Look at all these places. It's the civilian population that carries the can for the ambitions of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange, and communication, that'll do anything to maintain their power. You've been listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. It is broadcast across Australia, as I said before, via the Community Radio Network. Few web pages you may be interested in. Defend and extend public housing, everybody's business. You can actually write to me. Yes, I do respond to letters. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. You can email me at anarchistage@yahoo.com or public interest before corporate interest. YouTube channels, josephtoscano.nam. If you can actually see the presentations I've made about pivotal moments in Australian history. And if you are in Melbourne town tonight, which I think is the 19th, it is the 19th of June, you can always join me at the Footscray Hotel. That's at 48 Hopkins Street in Footscray, 6:30pm for a 7pm start. I'll be talking about the significance of the Tolpuddle martyrs. And don't forget, this program is broadcast from a community radio station. As I said before, we are $3,000 short of our target here on the Anarchist World this week. We've raised $8,500. We're nearly there. So you can always ring on 9419 8377, make a contribution, keep the Anarchist World this week part of your listening program every week. You can always donate by going to 3cr.org.au/donate. And don't forget to support your local community radio station if you're listening to this program, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Give them a ring. Maybe you got nothing to do. Maybe they need some volunteers. Give them a ring. Maybe they need a financial contribution. Community radio broadcasting, not narrowcasting, is pivotal in the struggle to change this society. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, next week.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Are you a 3CR subscriber?
We really need our listeners to subscribe to the station. It helps us remain financially independent and is an important part of our community governance.
It's just $40 concession, $80 waged, $150 for a band or organisation, and $300 solidarity.
Become a 3CR subscriber today.
3CR Radical Radio.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.